Hi, everyone, and welcome to our lesson for the Campus Urban Farm on urban gardening. So why garden? So visitors come to the Campus Urban Farm, and we really want to let them know that gardening or farming is a valuable activity. Community gardens have been shown to provide many health benefits, in addition to providing more green space, which in general is just good for mental health. They also provide access to nutritious foods that might not be otherwise available. Additionally, the physical activity from gardening is an easy and low impact way to get some exercise. So it's really good for health, it's good for the environment, it's good for feeding people. So that's really an activity we want to encourage our visitors to pursue. In terms of the environmental benefits, gardening is great because it acts as an additional carbon sink. It helps improve local air quality and helps reduce carbon emissions that would otherwise be caused by the whole packaging and transportation of food that comes with our industrial food system. The urban farm's main function on campus is as a living laboratory, but it also essentially functions as a small scale community garden to give people access to urban gardening and then get outside and actually help out on campus. In terms of the concept of urban farming that we want to impart with our to our users, is that one great way to reduce your waste impact is to grow your own produce. So even if it's not a ton of production, just any little ways that we can help. Um, Although we live in an urban area where we don't have a lot of open land space to farm, we don't want that to limit you. And you still can have significant production by being creative and adjusting your methods. So we want to make sure that everyone has some basic knowledge around that. So the first question, if you're looking to garden or farm, is the question of what should you plant? So really carefully thinking about what's your crop choice in terms of what season is it, what do I actually want to plant, as well as the important concept that often gets neglected about companion planting and whether you're fostering an environment for pollinators. And also looking more creatively in terms of the way people think about farming or gardening. People tend to assume that if you don't have a lot of outdoor space, you don't have options, which isn't true. So even if you're in a limited space situation, there's still some great options when it comes to indoor gardening, patio gardening, small yard gardening, also looking at vertical gardening in terms of going up instead of out if you don't have a lot of space, and even going down to container planting and scrap gardening, which pretty much anyone with a window can do. So there's still a lot of creative options out there, which we'll go over with this lesson. So starting off with what to plant. So here at the Campus Urban Farm, we're a little bit different because our priorities really look at plants that can, number one, provide food to the campus food pantries. So we're really looking at very high producing, valuable crops. On top of that, we also want to make sure that anything else we plant is supporting the health or production of those said crops. So you'll see a lot of examples of companion planting, as well as plants that encourage pollinators at the Campus Urban Farm. Outside of that, we also value anything that has high functionality when it comes to cooking and application. So you'll see a lot of herbs at the Campus Urban Farm because they have a lot of value in these areas. Otherwise, you'll also see some examples of flowers or vegetables or other herbs or shrubs and things like that that have some sort of inherent functional value. So we do educational activities around, let's say, making cosmetics, so soaps and scrubs and things that enhance our educational messaging around wanting to encourage people to garden for themselves, as well as medicinal and or educational purposes. So for example, our demonstration beds where there's actually a educational function to having those plants around, and they might have functional value as well. So there are specific purposes to the things that we plant at the farm and why. So in terms of when it comes to making your crop choices, aka what to plant, our emphasis is really on high value food for pantries. Because one of our top missions is to provide food to the campus food pantries, we want to make sure we're growing crops that are useful to them, that the students who are frequenting those pantries can actually use very easily or have access to. So we're really focusing on plants that have very high production, They're very popular. So if a student encounters that in a food pantry, they're not going to be like, oh, what is this? It's actually something that they'll know how to use fairly easily. And also storage and, just being able to keep that crop. And as it makes that trip from the farm over to the pantry and might sit there for a couple of days, we want to have very easy to store and keep crops as well. So we actually have a list of example top 10 vegetables and fruits to grow for food pantries linked in your syllabus. So we often refer to that list in terms of deciding what we plant in a given season. The other second factor that's going to really influence your crop choices is when is it? So when to plant is extremely important because all of your plant choices are going to be determined by the season that you're in. Here we're obviously in Southern California, so we have pretty established growing seasons. Unlike the rest of the country, we have a pretty long warm season. So that's basically essentially anytime from March through September will do fairly well with any warm season crop. Once we get into the fall and winter, then October through February is generally when we start shifting over to cool season crops. And there are pretty well documented resources around what will grow well in particular seasons based on Southern California specifically. And again, that is linked in your syllabus if you want to take a look. So in addition to deciding what to plant and when to plant it, it's also really important to consider the factors of that particular plant species. And it's really important to factor in right plant and right place. So you really need to make sure the growing conditions for anything you select, whether that's the size of the bed, how much sunlight it receives, etc., as well as the spacing are correct. So a lot of amateur gardeners tend to overplant in a particular area because, oh, well, this plant looks so small and I want to maximize my production. So let me put a bunch in there. But you really need to pay attention to that spacing because that plant's not going to be successful if it doesn't have the space to grow. So it's really important to carefully read the back of the seed packet when you're actually starting to plant and or do research before you go and plant something because you want to make sure that that plant is successful in the space that you're giving it. And ultimately, you need to pick a plant that's going to be successful for where you're trying to plant. So those are all factors to consider when making your crop choices. So coming down to specifically containers and bed sizing, the 4x4 beds that you see at the Campus Urban Farm works for most crops, but not all. So just because we have that space doesn't mean all crops are going to grow universally well. You also need to evaluate the height as well as the width. So for example, if you have a very tall plant, was it actually going to fit under the PVC cages that we have set up to protect it from the rabbits? If you're constantly swinging and it's going to get hit every time you lift that cage, that's probably not a good fit for the 4x4 bed. So that needs to be considered. Also the length of the bed. So if you have a super long vining plant, 4 feet might not be long enough. So that actually might not be a good fit for the raised beds that we have. Also, again, if you're going vertical, is it going to have enough trellis support? So if this is a vining plant that requires a lot of vertical structure, you need to make sure that your bed is actually capable of supporting that infrastructure to make sure it's successful. Also, you need to look again at that maximum growth spacing, not just the size of the seedling when it's a baby. So in terms of, again, making sure there's enough room for it to grow out, you don't want to plant every square inch if you know that it's going to turn into this huge vine that's going to require all the space in that bed. And you can actually also need to look at the aggressiveness of the plant because there are certain plants that are just highly aggressive. For example, mint, thyme. If you put it into a bed, it'll actually take over the whole bed eventually. So you need to make sure you're either putting it in a container or you're aware that that's what it's going to do. Tomatoes also get very, very large. So if you put a tomato seedling in there, it's going to explode during the peak warm season. So you need to make sure there's enough space around that tomato plant to accommodate that growth. Squashes and vines and things like that. Watermelon, same thing. It tends to explode during the warm season. It actually needs a lot of space to spread out. So these are all things that you need to do your research on before putting a plant into any kind of growing area. If you really do have your heart set on a particular plant, you can always think about a different bed or container style to accommodate those plants. So for example, at the farm, you can see that we have a specialty raised bed that's actually lower to the ground and it's a little bit longer than our 4x4 setup. And that's because we know that vines tend to spread out and it needs more length versus width when it comes to being successful. So you'll see that in that particular bed, we feature watermelon and squashes. So watermelon during the warm season, squash during the cool season. just because those require very like mounds where they actually can spread out via their vines on a length basis. Also, if you notice our herb container garden, we've actually contained a lot of those very invasive herbs into a single container. So if we put it into a container, we don't mind that it takes over the whole container because it's only in that little pot. So that's just an example of how you can control for that when it comes to your sizing restrictions. So crop planting is extremely important, whether it's at the farm or if you're at home. You want to think very carefully about your size and space limits. So definitely pick your plants based on the size and space that you have available to you. You might not be able to plant everything you want, so definitely make sure you look at that first. Also, it's important to think about the crop's life cycle. So when you're picking out a plant, there are major differences, namely in the life cycle of that plant. So a lot of the vegetables and fruits and things that we're used to are annual or biennial. So that means that after 1 year, that plant is basically done with its life cycle and it'll die or won't be productive anymore. So a plant that is only going to survive for 1 year is an annual and will need to be replanted every single growing season. Biennials tend to last only 2 years. So again, similarly, after 2 years, you're going to need to replace that plant. Perennials, on the other hand, tend to be everbearing, so they'll continue to live and thrive with every growing season, and you don't necessarily need to replace it until many years later. So that's something else that you need to think about because you also need to consider the maintenance requirements for that, as well as what are your investment costs in terms of starts or seeds. So if you're buying a ton of annuals every single season, you're going to have to go and buy more annuals every couple months to replace your garden versus if you mix that up with some perennials or biennials. Also, that really influences your crop harvest schedule. So if you really have your heart set on fresh salad, you need to think about, okay, well, this is a annual plant. So if I plant this at a particular time, I'm only going to get one crop out of it. So if you need to think about the timing in terms of like, okay, so do I get multiple plantings? So again, considering succession planting in terms of, okay, well, if I want salads all summer long, I'm going to have to start this pretty regularly in terms of batches. So if I want only one batch, it's going to grow through the whole season. But if I want multiple batches, I'll need to start a new batch every couple of weeks, as well as the types of crops too. So if you're looking at that timing, you have to consider, is the season going to change while I have these crops that are essentially waiting for maturity? So you don't want cool season crops to basically bleed over into the warm season and vice versa. So you actually need to time your crop planting based on the seasonal schedule as well. Companion cropping is also really important because that helps you get some more variety, as well as strengthen the plants that you have in that particular growing area. And finally, the final consideration is what will you actually eat or use? So you don't want to make the mistake of planting something you absolutely hate and won't have any use for just because you want to plant it, right? So, whether you can donate that or whether you can eat it or use it yourself, you want to plant stuff that you like generally or will use to make sure that that stuff doesn't go to waste. So those are all factors that go into your crop planting. Another important concept that we brought up several times is the concept of companion crops. So it's a documented fact that plants actually grow differently based on what's around them. So companion planting involves planting a variety of species near each other for a variety of benefits that they share. This could include pest control, it can include better pollination, include shade cover, physical support, etc. So these plants essentially get along really well together and they're friends because the other provides something that they need. One of the best known historical examples of companion crops are the Three Sisters, so corns, beans, and squash. So Mesoamerican cultures for hundreds and thousands of years have planted these three crops together because they're really good companions. So the corn essentially functions as a physical structure for the beans to grow on, while the beans actually replenish the soil's nitrogen supply to support all the crops, whereas the squash grows around the corn and the beans, and it actually creates a natural ground cover, and it helps basically retain moisture as well as prevent additional weeds from growing and taking nutrients. But there's hundreds and thousands of other companion crop like compatibility pairings that you can do. Some common ones include tomatoes with basil, carrots with onions, cauliflower with spinach. So there's a whole bunch of research out there into different companion crops that grow well together. So don't let that limit you in terms of thinking creatively about how to plan your crop plantings. And don't look just at vegetables either, because many herbs and flowers in particular can be very helpful companion crops to a variety of commonly grown vegetables. So there, look outside of the species in terms of just focusing on crop producing vegetables, but also looking at those other elements as well. And the flip side of this too is that there's many plant companions that all support each other, but there are also plant foes. So things like if you grow your tomatoes next to Brussels sprouts, it'll actually inhibit the growth of both because they just don't get along. So little things like that are really important for a successful garden. So definitely make sure you're checking and researching compatibility charts before planting two species next to each other to maximize your production in your garden. Another important element for a successful garden is looking at pollinators. So no plant will actually produce without pollinators. So pollinators, both native and non-native, are extremely crucial for growing many crops. So unless you want lots of flowers that never turn into anything, you definitely want to make sure there are pollinators in your garden. And placing native plants in particular in your garden near your crops will help increase your harvest yields, but also provide crucial habitats for many local pollinators, which is what we want to support as a local ecosystem. So there's also other structures that can be added to your garden to attract pollinators. It doesn't just need to be the plants and flowers themselves. You can actually create homemade nesting sites or fountains, like for bees or butterflies, to help encourage that migration over to your garden and to help attract those pollinators. And also one of the easiest ways to help out declining pollinator populations is to use those natural and organic pesticides as opposed to much more harmful synthetic options, which tend to eliminate all insects in the garden, in addition, not just the bad insects, but also the beneficial ones as well. So essentially gardening organically can really help to alleviate this and help encourage pollinators to come to your garden. So in terms of other solutions, so you don't need necessarily acres and acres of land to be productive. If you're limited to an indoor or patio kind of setup, indoor gardens can come in many shapes and sizes, ranging from huge commercial indoor greenhouses to just simple planters that can be placed inside your home. Don't overlook windowsills because those can actually you can actually make windowsill planters or buy one that can be utilized to maximize the amount of sun that your plants have access to, while still minimizing that empty space, that amount of space that they take up. And small planters can also be placed indoors to grow small crops like herbs. So, don't overlook the fact that you can bring the garden inside too. And also you can use containers to really build a robust garden, even in small deck and patio setups. As you can see in the picture to your left, there's actually a variety of crops growing in there in just containers. So there's actually a way to get variety that way as well. There's also some small household systems commercially available that come with a grow light, like the aquaponic system that we have at the farm, or you can just add your own own light if you're in a really low light indoor situation where you're not sure you're going to get enough natural sunlight to support plants. So those are all options that you can use to think creatively and still have an indoor and patio setup. Another thing to look at if you're working with a small space is vertical gardening. So vertical gardens really maximize the amount you can grow indoors or in a small space by utilizing the vertical space in your home. So really thinking creatively and growing up instead of growing out. And larger vertical gardens can actually cover entire walls. And that not only produces more food for you, but that can actually be used to decrease the temperature of the room inside. So there's actually a documented green cooling effect by placing plants on a location. So instead of the heat just from the sun just entering your house, you can actually use it to deflect that heat and actually take it have the plants take that in instead. So it can actually help on your cooling bills as well. And vertical gardens are very easy to build, and they don't necessarily require any special materials. You can even upcycle something as simple, like in the picture to your left, is like an old shoe rack, container. You can use cloth, you can use old food jars, you can use plastic water bottles, you can use PVC pipes. There's a lot of different ways you can make a vertical garden, and a lot of them can actually create some aesthetic value to your home and actually be a decorative piece as well. And in terms of easy indoor gardening tips, when you're gardening indoors, obviously limited sunlight can be the hugest issue in terms of being able to produce plants. So if you are facing this scenario, you can also try changing up what you're going to grow. Generally, leafy greens like spinach or lettuce grow well even in shaded areas and actually kind of prefer the cooler temperatures. So that might be a good fit for you in terms of the crops that you're picking out. Also, when dealing with limited space, certain plants are better adapted for vertical gardening, like many bean varieties are. Like they naturally grow up and they like that vertical trellis system. So that's also something you want to factor in terms of your plant choices. And herbs are also a really great simple addition for your indoor garden. Almost anyone can grow herbs, even in a limited space. And even just a small amount of growth can really go a long way in the kitchen in terms of really enhancing your culinary dishes. So it has a lot of value. And also it's you don't have to necessarily have plants or dirt to really get started. Sometimes kitchen scraps can actually be partially regrown in nothing but a glass of water. So for example, the bulbs of fennel, leeks, and green onion can actually just be submerged in water, and if you replace the water every 1 to 2 days, it'll just regrow on its own. The flavors will eventually dissipate over time when you continue to reuse the same bulbs, so they'll periodically need to be replaced. It's really a great way to get a second life out of the kitchen scraps that you're throwing away already. So that's another way to get easy starts and new plants for you, and even in a limited indoor setting. So there's a lot of creative ways to think about indoor gardening. So highly encourage you to do your research and think outside the box when it comes to your crop planting. Thanks so much.